The story of the Pilgrims' Journey to America is one of the most enduring narratives in the history of the United States, a tale of courage, faith, and perseverance that has been passed down through generations. It is a story that begins in the early 17th century, amid religious turmoil in England, where a group of devout Christians sought the freedom to worship as they pleased. These individuals, later known as the Pilgrims, were part of a larger movement called the Separatists, who believed that the Church of England was too corrupt to be reformed and thus chose to separate from it entirely. Their desire for religious liberty set them on a path that would eventually lead them across the treacherous Atlantic Ocean to the shores of a new and unfamiliar land. The Pilgrims first fled to the Netherlands in 1608, seeking refuge in the city of Leiden, where they were free to practice their religion without persecution. However, life in the Netherlands presented its own challenges. The Pilgrims struggled with economic hardships and feared that their children were losing their English identity and adopting Dutch customs. After more than a decade in Leiden, they began to consider a more radical solution, a journey to the New World, where they could establish a community based on their religious principles while remaining English in culture and allegiance. Securing funding for such an expedition was no easy task. The Pilgrims negotiated with a group of English investors known as the Merchant Adventurers, who agreed to finance their voyage in exchange for a share of the profits from the new colony. After months of preparation, the Pilgrims set sail from Plymouth, England, in September 1620 aboard the Mayflower, a ship that would become legendary in American history. The voyage was long and arduous, lasting 66 days, during which the passengers endured cramped conditions, violent storms, and sickness. Yet, despite these hardships, their resolve never wavered. When the Mayflower finally reached the coast of what is now Massachusetts in November 1620, the Pilgrims faced a harsh and unforgiving wilderness. They had intended to settle near the Hudson River, within the boundaries of the Virginia colony, but strong winds and treacherous currents forced them northward. Realizing they were outside any established government, the adult male passengers drafted the Mayflower Compact, a groundbreaking document that established a framework for self-governance based on the consent of the governed. This agreement would later be seen as an early step toward democratic governance in America. The first winter in the New World was devastating. The Pilgrims, unprepared for the brutal cold and lacking adequate shelter, suffered from malnutrition and disease. Nearly half of the original settlers perished before spring arrived. Yet, those who survived did so with the help of the Wampanoag people, a Native American tribe whose knowledge of the land proved invaluable. A Wampanoag named Squanto, or Squanto, played a particularly crucial role, teaching the Pilgrims how to cultivate corn, fish, and hunt in their new environment. His assistance, along with the guidance of the Wampanoag leader Massasoit, ensured the colony's survival. By the fall of 1621, the Pilgrims had reaped their first successful harvest. In gratitude, they organized a feast to celebrate their blessings and to thank their Native American allies. This event, later immortalized as the First Thanksgiving, symbolized a brief period of harmony between the settlers and the indigenous people. However, this peace would not last forever, as future conflicts over land and resources would strain relations between the two groups. The Pilgrim settlement, known as Plymouth Colony, grew slowly but steadily over the years. More ships arrived with additional settlers, and though life remained difficult, the colony became a symbol of perseverance and faith. The Pilgrims' legacy extended far beyond their small community, influencing the broader narrative of American history. Their quest for religious freedom, their establishment of self-rule, and their interactions with Native Americans all became foundational elements of the American identity. Over time, the story of the Pilgrims has been mythologized, often simplified or romanticized in popular retellings. Yet, at its core, it remains a powerful testament to human resilience and the pursuit of liberty. The Pilgrims' Journey to America was not just a physical voyage but a transformative experience that helped shape the ideals of a nation yet to be born. Their story continues to resonate, reminding us of the struggles and sacrifices that have defined the American experience. When the Pilgrims fled religious persecution in England and settled in Holland in 1608, they found themselves in a more tolerant religious environment but faced severe economic hardships that affected their daily lives and future decisions. The city of Leiden, where most of them settled, was a thriving commercial and industrial center, yet the job opportunities available to the Pilgrims were limited due to their skills and backgrounds. Many of them had worked in agriculture or simple crafts in England, but in Holland, they were forced to take on grueling, low-wage jobs such as textile work and wool spinning, which required long hours for barely enough income to sustain their families. Life in Holland was more expensive than in England, with high rents, taxes, and the cost of basic goods, making it difficult for the Pilgrims to secure a decent standard of living. Additionally, they struggled to adapt to the Dutch economic system, which relied heavily on international trade and specialized industries, areas in which many of them had no experience. This exacerbated poverty within their community, forcing them to labor under harsh conditions just to survive. Another economic challenge they faced was Dutch labor laws, which were not always favorable to foreign workers. While the Dutch were known for their relatively free economy, low wages, and intense competition made it difficult for the Pilgrims to achieve financial stability. Moreover, they could not easily own land, preventing them from establishing an independent farming community as they had hoped. Perhaps the greatest challenge, however, was the fear of losing their cultural and religious identity. As the Pilgrims' children worked in Dutch factories and shops, they began learning the Dutch language and adopting local customs, which worried their parents, who wanted to preserve their English heritage and religious values. Many feared that the second generation of Pilgrims would become disconnected from their roots, leading them to seek a new land where they could build a homogeneous community that upheld their beliefs and identity. All these economic and social factors pushed the Pilgrims to consider migrating once again, this time to the New World. They saw America as an opportunity to achieve the economic independence they had been unable to secure in Holland, a place where they could own land and establish a settlement that reflected their values without fear of persecution or cultural assimilation. Thus, the economic challenges they faced in Holland became one of the key motivations behind their historic voyage aboard the Mayflower to the New World. The story of the Pilgrims' years in Holland is one of those pivotal yet often overlooked chapters in history that shaped the destiny of a people and, ultimately, a new nation. When the small band of English separatists first crossed the North Sea to escape religious persecution in 1608, they found themselves thrust into one of the most dynamic and complex economies of early modern Europe. The Dutch Republic at the dawn of the 17th century stood as a marvel of economic innovation, its bustling cities, thriving trade networks, and burgeoning industries making it the envy of nations. Yet for these humble English farmers and craftsmen, this economic powerhouse would become both a refuge and a crucible, testing their community to its limits and forcing decisions that would echo across centuries. Leiden, their city of refuge, presented immediate challenges to these English exiles. The very factors that made Holland prosperous, its specialized industries, competitive markets, and high cost of living, created nearly insurmountable barriers for the newly arrived Pilgrims. Most had been agricultural workers in England's Nottinghamshire countryside, their hands accustomed to tilling soil rather than operating the complex looms and textile machinery that dominated Leiden's economy. The language barrier compounded their difficulties, as Dutch merchants and guild masters had little patience for English laborers struggling to comprehend both the technical terms of their trades and the rapid-fire dialect of their new home. The textile industry, which employed most of Leiden's working class, became both salvation and burden for the Pilgrim community. Men who had once tended their own fields now found themselves confined to poorly ventilated workshops, their lungs filling with wool fibers as they labored 14-hour days at the grueling task of say weaving. The work was piecemeal, paid by completed yardage rather than hourly wages, with market fluctuations sometimes cutting their already meager earnings in half without warning. Women and children fared no better, the spinning wheels that occupied their days yielding barely enough income to pay the inflated rents of Leiden's crowded tenements. Economic records from the period paint a stark picture of their struggles. Where an English farm laborer might have earned 8 pence per day in his homeland, his counterpart in Leiden's textile mills earned the equivalent of just 4 pence after currency exchange, a sum that barely covered basic necessities when a single loaf of bread cost a full stuver. Rent consumed nearly half their income, leaving little for fuel or clothing. The bitter North Sea winters proved especially cruel, with the price of peat for heating soaring beyond reach during cold snaps. Letters back to England spoke of chilblained fingers gripping frozen looms and children bundled in rags against the damp chill of their unheated rooms. Beyond the daily struggle for survival, the the Pilgrims faced systemic barriers in Dutch society. The guild system, which controlled access to skilled trades, remained largely closed to these foreign interlopers. Attempts to establish their own businesses foundered on lack of capital and local connections. Even their strict religious observance worked against them. While Dutch workers commonly labored Sunday afternoons after morning services, the Pilgrims' unwavering commitment to a full day of Sabbath rest meant forfeiting precious hours of productivity. Perhaps most alarmingly for the community's leaders, the economic pressures began eroding the very cultural and religious identity they had risked everything to preserve. Young people, desperate to escape the grinding poverty of their parents' existence, increasingly adopted Dutch ways. Teenagers took to speaking the local language exclusively, dressing in fashionable Dutch clothing, and even abandoning their parents' strict religious observances for the more liberal Dutch churches. Elder William Brewster lamented in his letters how the youth were being drawn away by evil examples into extravagant and dangerous courses, their English identity dissolving in the melting pot of Dutch commerce. The Pilgrims made several attempts to break this cycle of poverty. In 1611, they negotiated with Leiden authorities to establish an English-operated cloth factory, hoping to create a self-contained economic niche. The venture collapsed when Dutch investors withdrew support. Some families tried relocating to Amsterdam's more diverse economy, only to find even fiercer competition and higher living costs. Others contemplated agricultural settlements in the Dutch countryside, but found farmland prices prohibitive. Each failed experiment deepened their sense of economic entrapment. By 1617, multiple crises converged to force a decision. A currency devaluation wiped out much of their meager savings. A poor harvest year sent food prices skyrocketing. Rumors of renewed war between Spain and the Netherlands threatened the region's economic stability. It was against this backdrop that the Pilgrim leadership began seriously considering the radical solution proposed by some members: emigration to the uncharted territories of North America. The economic lessons learned in Holland would profoundly shape the Plymouth colony's development. Having witnessed the vulnerabilities of wage labor and urban dependence, they structured their New World settlement around land ownership and diversified subsistence. Their experience with Dutch commercial practices informed their careful financial planning, helping them avoid the debt traps that doomed other early colonies. Even their famous Mayflower Compact reflected economic lessons from Holland, establishing rules for collective resource management born from years of shared struggle. The 12 years in Holland thus represent far more than a simple interlude between English persecution and American settlement. They were the forge in which the Pilgrim community's economic philosophy was hammered out, a philosophy that would influence New England's development and, through it, the broader American approach to community, labor, and self-governance. The very hardships that made Holland unsustainable as a permanent home created the resilient, pragmatic, and mutually supportive community that could survive the even greater challenges of the New World. In this light, the Pilgrims' economic struggles in Holland emerge as one of the foundational experiences of American history, a crucible that transformed a band of persecuted religious dissenters into the architects of a new model of community that would shape a nation's economic and social development for centuries to come. Their Leiden experience taught them that religious freedom required economic independence, that communal survival demanded shared sacrifice, and that true liberty could only be built on a foundation of mutual support and collective responsibility. These lessons, forged in the textile mills and tenements of a Dutch city, would become cornerstones of the American experiment. The decision of the Pilgrims to leave Europe and settle in America marked a pivotal moment in history, one that would forever alter the lives of the Wampanoag tribe and shape the future of Native European relations. The Pilgrims, seeking religious freedom and economic opportunity, arrived on the shores of what is now Massachusetts in 1620, unprepared for the harsh realities of the New World. Their survival hinged on the assistance of the Wampanoag people, who had inhabited the region for thousands of years. However, what began as a tentative alliance born of mutual necessity gradually transformed into a relationship marred by cultural misunderstandings, land disputes, and eventual conflict. The Wampanoag, led by leaders such as Massasoit, initially extended a hand of friendship to the struggling settlers. They shared vital knowledge about agriculture, hunting, and survival in an unfamiliar environment. Without this aid, the Pilgrims might not have endured their first brutal winter. The famous harvest celebration in 1621, often romanticized as the first Thanksgiving, symbolized this brief period of cooperation. Yet, beneath the surface, tension simmered. The Pilgrims viewed the land as theirs by divine right, while the Wampanoag saw them as potential allies against rival tribes but also as unpredictable newcomers whose growing numbers posed a long-term threat. As more English settlers arrived, the balance of power shifted. The once dominant Wampanoag found themselves increasingly marginalized, their lands encroached upon by expanding colonies. The death of Massasoit and the rise of his son Metacomet, known to the English as King Philip, marked a turning point. Frustrated by broken treaties and cultural erosion, Metacomet led a violent uprising in 1675, known as King Philip's War. The conflict was devastating for both sides, but particularly for the Wampanoag, who suffered immense losses and saw their sovereignty nearly destroyed. The Pilgrims' arrival, therefore, set in motion a chain of events that reshaped Wampanoag society. What began as a fragile partnership based on survival ended in warfare and displacement. The legacy of this relationship echoes through history, serving as a poignant example of the complexities and tragedies inherent in the collision of two vastly different worlds. The Pilgrims' decision to leave Europe and settle in America was a pivotal moment in history, one that forever altered the lives of the Wampanoag tribe and shaped the future of Native European relations. Seeking religious freedom and economic opportunities, the Pilgrims arrived on the shores of what is now Massachusetts in 1620, unprepared for the harsh challenges of the New World. Their survival depended on the assistance of the Wampanoag people, who had inhabited the region for thousands of years. What began as a tentative alliance born of mutual necessity gradually evolved into a relationship marked by cultural misunderstandings, land disputes, and eventual conflict. Initially, the Wampanoag, led by leaders such as Massasoit, extended a hand of friendship to the struggling settlers. They shared crucial knowledge about agriculture, hunting, and survival in an unfamiliar environment. Without this aid, the Pilgrims might not have endured their first brutal winter. The famous harvest celebration of 1621, often romanticized as the first Thanksgiving, symbolized this brief period of cooperation. Yet, beneath the surface, tension simmered. The Pilgrims viewed the land as theirs by divine right, while the Wampanoag saw them as potential allies against rival tribes but also as unpredictable newcomers whose growing numbers posed a long-term threat. As more English settlers arrived, the balance of power shifted. The once powerful Wampanoag found themselves increasingly marginalized as colonial expansion encroached upon their lands. The death of Massasoit and the rise of his son Metacomet, known to the English as King Philip, marked a turning point. Frustrated by broken treaties and cultural erosion, Metacomet led a violent uprising in 1675, known as King Philip's War. The conflict was devastating for both sides, but particularly for the Wampanoag, who suffered immense losses and saw their sovereignty nearly destroyed. Thus, the Pilgrims' arrival set in motion a chain of events that reshaped Wampanoag society. What began as a fragile partnership based on survival ended in war and displacement. The legacy of this relationship echoes through history as a poignant example of the complexities and tragedies that arise when two vastly different worlds collide. The arrival of the Pilgrims in America was not merely a journey in search of religious freedom, it was also a complex investment venture involving financial backers who sought profits from this risky endeavor. The Mayflower Voyage of 1620 resulted from a collaboration between a group of religious separatists breaking away from the Church of England and a group known as the Adventurers, businessmen and investors from London and southern England who saw the New World as an opportunity for immense wealth. The story began when the Pilgrims, a group of Puritan separatists, fled England to escape religious persecution and settled in Leiden, Holland. However, life there was far from ideal. Despite religious freedom, they faced economic hardships and feared their children's identity would dissolve into Dutch society. Thus, they began considering migration to a new land where they could preserve their faith and build their own community. Yet, executing this plan required substantial funding, as the costs of crossing the Atlantic and establishing a colony in an unknown land were exorbitant. This is where the adventurers, or financial investors, came into play. They agreed to fund the voyage in exchange for a share in the future profits of the colony. These investors were connected to the Virginia Company, which held colonial rights in North America under a royal charter. The Pilgrims and the investors signed an agreement known as the Joint Stock Company Contract, stipulating that the colonists would work for the company for 7 years, after which profits would be divided between the two parties. However, the relationship between the Pilgrims and the investors was far from smooth, as their visions clashed. The Pilgrims wanted to build an independent religious community, while the investors focused on financial returns, leading to ongoing tensions. When the Pilgrims arrived in America, they faced a harsh winter and famine, leaving them unable to produce enough resources to repay their debts. The investors attempted to send more settlers and supplies to salvage the venture, but disputes persisted, especially as the Pilgrims realized that the system imposed by the investors restricted their freedom. After years of conflict, the Pilgrims eventually managed to buy out the investors' shares and end their financial dependency, allowing them to govern the Plymouth colony independently. Nevertheless, the role of the investors remained crucial in making the journey financially possible, shaping the entire course of American history. The autumn of 1620 marked more than just the sailing of an old wine ship across the Atlantic. It represented the culmination of years of complex financial negotiations that would forever alter the course of American history. Behind the religious idealism of the Pilgrims lurked a less celebrated but equally important group, the London merchants and venture capitalists who made the Mayflower expedition possible through a combination of economic calculation and speculative risk-taking. These financial architects operated within the emerging world of joint stock companies that characterized England's early colonial ventures. The Virginia Company's near collapse after the Jamestown disaster had made investors wary of New World projects, yet the Pilgrims' proposal presented an unusual opportunity. What distinguished this venture was its dual nature, part religious refuge, part commercial enterprise, that appealed to different factions within England's investment circles. The financial negotiations stretched back to 1617 when the Leiden separatists first sought backing. Merchant adventurers like Thomas Weston saw potential in funding a colony that combined religious discipline with economic productivity. Weston's consortium included ironmongers, haberdashers, and wealthy gentry who pooled £1,500, equivalent to nearly £300,000 today, a staggering sum that reflected both the voyage's costs and the investors' expectations of substantial returns. The contract's terms revealed the inherent tension between the Pilgrims' ideals and financial realities. Colonists would work 4 days weekly for company profit and 2 for themselves, with all property held communally for 7 years. This common course system, modeled after earlier Virginia arrangements, immediately created friction. Elder William Bradford later recalled how this communistic plan bred confusion and discontent among settlers unaccustomed to such constraints. The investors' demands grew increasingly unrealistic as the venture progressed. They insisted on sending additional settlers ill-suited for frontier life, particulars who traveled independently but drained scarce resources. The disastrous 1622 shipment of 60 settlers, including many single men with no farming experience, nearly destroyed Plymouth's fragile food supplies. Investor John Pierce's 1621 patent extension attempt, which would have made colonists virtual tenants, further poisoned relations. Financial pressures shaped critical decisions throughout Plymouth's early years. The colony's desperate need to show profitability led to the 1621 peace agreement with Massasoit, partly motivated by the Wampanoag's ability to facilitate the fur trade. The establishment of trading posts at Aptuxet and Kennebec reflected investor demands for marketable commodities rather than agricultural self-sufficiency. The breaking point came in 1626 when 8 leading colonists, including Bradford and Standish, assumed £1,800 of debt to buy out the investors. This leveraged buyout, financed through beaver pelts and other goods, finally severed the London connection after 6 years of strained relations. The agreement's success ironically demonstrated the colony's economic viability, precisely what the original investors had doubted. These financial machinations left enduring marks on American development. The investor-colonist conflict anticipated later tensions between metropolitan capital and colonial self-governance. The buyout established precedents for colonial debt financing that would recur throughout American history. Even the Thanksgiving legend obscures how the 1621 harvest celebration served partly to reassure anxious investors of the colony's potential. When the Pilgrims arrived on the shores of North America in 1620, they carried with them a steadfast faith and deep religious principles that shaped every aspect of their new lives in the New World. Their journey was not merely a migration in search of new land but a spiritual quest to establish a pure religious community, free from what they saw as the corruption of the Church of England. From the moment their feet touched the land of Plymouth, the influence of their religious beliefs became evident in their social organization, laws, family relationships, and even their interactions with the Native Americans. The strict Protestant faith embraced by the Pilgrims relied on a literal interpretation of the Bible, leading them to live an austere life filled with spiritual and material discipline. At the heart of their daily lives was worship. Each day began with communal prayer, followed by Bible reading and theological discussions. Sunday was entirely dedicated to worship, with any worldly labor, including cooking or unnecessary travel, strictly forbidden. Even children were required to attend lengthy religious services that lasted hours, as religious education was a fundamental part of their upbringing. In Pilgrim society, the family was a religious unit before being a social one. The father served as the spiritual leader of the household, responsible for teaching his children the principles of faith, while the mother ensured the home remained a place of piety and virtue. Marriage was not merely a social contract but a sacred covenant, and divorce was rejected except in extremely rare cases. In their work, the Pilgrims saw labor and diligence as forms of worship. Laziness was considered a sin, while hard work was seen as evidence of divine grace. Even in agriculture, the backbone of their economy, they believed God would bless their harvests if they remained faithful to his teachings. In their dealings with Native Americans, the Pilgrims held a complex stance. On one hand, they viewed them as heathens in need of evangelization, yet they also treated them with caution and sometimes hostility, fearing their influence on the purity of their religious community. Nevertheless, there were moments of cooperation, such as the aid they received from Squanto, which they saw as divine intervention to save them from starvation. The laws established by the Pilgrims in their colony were directly derived from religious principles. Any violation of Christian morals was severely punished, whether it was drunkenness, blasphemy, or absence from prayer. Even clothing was subject to strict laws ensuring modesty and austerity. Far from the extravagance they had criticized in Europe, education, too, was a means of spreading faith. From childhood, children learned to read using the Bible, and the primary goal of education was to produce a generation capable of understanding religious texts and defending their doctrine. Even schools, when established, were under the supervision of the church. Life was not easy, and famines and diseases posed significant challenges, but the Pilgrims saw every hardship as a divine test of their faith. When half of them perished in the first winter, they viewed it as a purification of the spiritually weak. When their crops later succeeded, they saw it as a blessing from heaven. Over time, the influence of religious beliefs waned as the colonies expanded and mingled with other cultures, but the Pilgrims' legacy endured in core American values such as hard work, self-reliance, and the belief in religion's role in public life. The early years of the Pilgrims in America were marked by immense hardship, struggle, and perseverance. Arriving on the shores of what would later become Plymouth Colony in November 1620, these English separatists faced a brutal and unforgiving environment. Their journey aboard the Mayflower had been arduous, and the challenges they encountered upon landing were even greater. The first winter was particularly devastating, with disease, starvation, and harsh weather claiming many lives. Yet, through resilience and the assistance of Native Americans, the Pilgrims managed to establish a foothold in the New World, laying the foundation for future settlements. The initial months in America were a test of survival. The Pilgrims had intended to settle near the Hudson River, but storms forced them to land at Cape Cod, far north of their intended destination. With winter setting in, they had little time to prepare adequate shelter. Many of the settlers remained aboard the Mayflower for weeks while exploratory parties scouted the area for a suitable location. When they finally chose Plymouth as their settlement site, the work of building homes began in earnest. However, the lack of proper tools, the freezing temperatures, and the general exhaustion from the voyage made construction slow and difficult. The first winter was a time of extreme suffering. Nearly half of the original 102 passengers died from scurvy, pneumonia, and other illnesses exacerbated by malnutrition and exposure. The communal living arrangements aboard the ship and in the hastily built shelters facilitated the spread of disease. Families watched helplessly as loved ones perished, and the survivors struggled to bury the dead in the frozen ground. The Pilgrims' faith was tested, yet they clung to their belief that God had brought them to this land for a purpose. Spring brought some relief, but the challenges were far from over. The survivors were weakened, and food supplies were dangerously low. Fortunately, they encountered the Wampanoag people, particularly Squanto, a Patuxet tribesman who had previously been enslaved in Europe and spoke English. Squanto and other Native Americans taught the Pilgrims essential survival skills, such as how to cultivate corn, fish for local species, and navigate the unfamiliar terrain. Without this assistance, the colony might not have survived its first year. The Pilgrims' relationship with the Wampanoag was complex. While there were moments of cooperation, most notably the harvest celebration that would later inspire the Thanksgiving tradition, tensions over land and cultural differences persisted. The Pilgrims viewed the land as theirs by divine right, while the Native Americans saw them as potential allies against rival tribes but also as a growing threat to their sovereignty. Despite these underlying tensions, the initial years saw a fragile peace that allowed the colony to stabilize. By the mid-1620s, living conditions had improved somewhat. The Pilgrims had built more permanent houses, cleared fields for agriculture, and established trade relations with both Native Americans and other European settlers. However, life remained difficult. Food shortages were common, especially in the early years when crops failed or supplies from England were delayed. The settlers relied heavily on fish, wild game, and the corn they had learned to grow, but winters were still a time of scarcity. Disease continued to be a major threat. The dense living conditions and lack of medical knowledge meant that outbreaks could spread rapidly. Many children died in infancy, and adults often succumbed to infections that would be treatable today. The physical labor required for survival, clearing land, building homes, planting crops, was exhausting and left many vulnerable to illness and injury. Socially, the Pilgrims maintained a strict, religiously governed society. Their laws were based on Puritan principles, and dissent was not tolerated. While they had sought religious freedom for themselves, they were not inclined to extend that freedom to others with differing beliefs. This rigidity sometimes led to conflicts within the colony, as not all settlers shared the same level of devotion or agreed on governance. Despite these hardships, the Pilgrims' determination ensured their survival. Their early years in America were a testament to human endurance in the face of overwhelming odds. By adapting to their new environment and forming alliances with Native Americans, they laid the groundwork for future European colonization. Their story, though romanticized in later centuries, was one of profound struggle and sacrifice, a defining chapter in the history of America. The winter of 1620 was harsh by any measure, its freezing winds sweeping across the shores that would later be known as Plymouth, bringing indescribable suffering to the small group of pilgrims who had arrived aboard the Mayflower. These men, women, and children were unprepared for what awaited them. The new land was not the lush, bountiful paradise they had imagined. It was a brutal wilderness guarded by short, dark days and long, frostbitten nights. When they disembarked from the ship, they found themselves in a world without shelter, without sufficient food, and with no knowledge of how to endure the winter that was already tightening its icy grip around them. They began building huts from wood and clay, but their untrained hands made the structures flimsy, the wind seeping through the cracks just as their strength seeped away day by day. Disease did not wait long to strike. Coughs, fevers, and scurvy began claiming them one after another, so much so that many died before they could even finish a roof to cover them. Yet in the midst of this despair, a glimmer of hope appeared from where they least expected it. A man of the Patuxet people, named Squanto, came to them like a gift from the heavens, or so they believed. He spoke English, not because he had learned it in school, but because he had once been kidnapped by European slavers and spent years in Europe before finding his way back home. He taught them how to plant corn in a way they had never heard of, by placing a small fish in the hole with the seed, how to fish in frozen rivers, and how to find edible roots beneath the snow. And Squanto was not alone. Massasoit, the leader of the Wampanoag, came with watchful eyes and a cautious heart. He saw in these strangers an opportunity to gain allies against rival tribes threatening his people, so he offered them food in the worst days of winter and taught them hunting techniques perfected by his ancestors over centuries. When spring arrived, the ice began to melt, and so did their hearts. The Pilgrims planted their first seeds with the help of their new friends and watched them grow as if witnessing a miracle. When harvest time came, they gathered what they had sown along with the bounty of the sea and forest and invited Massasoit and his men to share in a feast they did not yet know would become the foundation of a tradition called Thanksgiving. But the story was not so simple. What had transpired was not merely cooperation between two cultures, it was a transaction of survival in a merciless world. The Pilgrims knew that without help, they would perish. The Wampanoag knew that these strangers, with their guns, could be weapons against their enemies. And between these truths, a legend of survival was born, a legend that would be told for centuries, though not always with acknowledgement of the price paid by the other side. When the Pilgrims reached the shores of the New World in the autumn of 1620, the land they named Plymouth was nothing but a harsh wilderness, swept by biting winds and dense, unfamiliar forests. Winter was not merely a challenge, it was a test of survival itself. The Mayflower, the ship that had carried them across the Atlantic, had already weakened their health. Many suffered from malnutrition and dehydration after months of inhuman conditions at sea. The problem was not just the brutal cold but the lack of adequate shelter and food. In the first few months, the dream of building a new settlement turned into a nightmare of suffering. Disease began to spread among them like wildfire. The first to strike was scurvy, that dreaded illness caused by the lack of fresh fruits and vegetables. The Pilgrims noticed their gums bleeding, their teeth loosening, and their limbs swelling and bruising. Some could no longer rise from their beds, their bodies reduced to skeletal figures covered in lesions. They had no idea that citrus or fresh greens could save them. Medical knowledge at the time was painfully limited, yet scurvy was not the only killer. Infectious diseases like pneumonia and tuberculosis spread rapidly among the Pilgrims, who were forced to live in cramped, damp quarters. Bloody coughs and raging fevers became daily sights. Even deadlier was what they called the Great Sickness, a lethal mix of dysentery and respiratory infections. Men, women, and children died indiscriminately, leaving behind unmarked graves in the winter snow. Starvation was never far from this catastrophe. The food supplies they had brought from England quickly ran out, and their early attempts at farming and hunting failed due to their ignorance of the land. Many resorted to eating roots, tree bark, and even the leather from their shoes. Some died from poisoning after consuming unknown plants, while others collapsed from exhaustion and hunger before spring arrived. Nature was not their only enemy. Relations with the Native Americans, though later their salvation, were initially a source of anxiety. The Pilgrims feared potential attacks, but the real danger was the diseases Europeans had brought to the indigenous tribes. While the Pilgrims died by the dozens, tribes like the Wampanoag were already suffering from smallpox and measles epidemics, which had decimated their numbers long before first contact. Yet by early 1621, a glimmer of hope emerged. With the help of Squanto and other natives, the Pilgrims learned to cultivate corn and fish. Their nutrition gradually improved, and scurvy symptoms began to recede. As they built sturdier homes and organized their settlement, the toll of disease lessened, though death remained a constant companion in those early years. When the Pilgrims disembarked from the Mayflower onto the shores of the New World, they found themselves in a strange land utterly different from anything they had known in England. The biting cold of New England's first winter stung their faces as their eyes searched desperately for shelter from the ocean's fierce winds. They had only meager supplies, some farming tools unsuited to this new land, and limited experience facing such challenges. In contrast, the Wampanoag people, the original inhabitants of this land, watched these strangers with curiosity and caution. Their ancestors had lived here for thousands of years, mastering the arts of survival in this harsh environment. Their villages dotted the coastline, their sturdy homes made of flexible wood covered with tree bark standing proud against winter storms. The Pilgrims suffered unimaginable hardships in their first months. Their temporary shelters were crude huts, their walls of mud and branches offering little protection against the bitter cold. Disease spread among them at terrifying speed, with many succumbing to pneumonia and deadly colds. Lacking sufficient knowledge of this land, their initial attempts at farming and hunting failed. The Wampanoag people, however, lived in harmony with nature. Their intelligently designed homes stayed warm in winter and cool in summer. Their diet was diverse and rich, based on cultivated corn, squash and beans, supplemented by fishing and hunting. They possessed deep knowledge of medicinal plants for treating illnesses. The first winter proved especially harsh for the Pilgrims. Many died of hunger and disease, some buried in unmarked graves lest the natives discover their weakness. Meanwhile, their Wampanoag neighbors had stored winter provisions effectively and knew how to find food even in the harshest conditions. In the autumn of 1620, a group of English pilgrims arrived on the shores of what is now Massachusetts, exhausted from their long journey across the Atlantic. They were strangers in a new world, lacking knowledge of the harsh climate and the unfamiliar land they were to settle. As the brutal winter set in, hunger and disease began to ravage them, and many perished before seeing spring. Yet, at a critical moment of despair, a man from the Patuxet tribe named Squanto, or as the English called him, Squanto, emerged as a bridge between two conflicting worlds. Squanto was a unique figure, having previously lived among Europeans after being kidnapped by English sailors years earlier and taken to Europe, where he learned their language and customs. Upon returning to his homeland, he found his village destroyed by diseases brought by the colonists. Though bitterness may have filled his heart, he chose to help the Pilgrims, not out of naivety, but perhaps because he understood that an alliance with them might grant him influence in a rapidly changing world. Squanto began his work by mediating negotiations between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag leader, Massasoit, leading to a peace treaty in the spring of 1621. This treaty was not merely a diplomatic agreement but a guarantee of survival, promising the Pilgrims protection from hostile tribes while securing the Wampanoag a powerful ally against their enemies. Yet Squanto's role extended far beyond political mediation. When the planting season arrived, the Pilgrims realized their European farming methods were ill-suited to the New World soil. Here, Squanto stepped in, teaching them how to cultivate corn, an unfamiliar crop that would become their staple food. He showed them how to bury small fish with the seeds to fertilize the soil, a technique they had never encountered. He also guided them to the best fishing and shellfish gathering spots and taught them the seasons for wild harvests, where they could gather berries, nuts, and medicinal herbs. His knowledge of nature was not the only thing that saved them, his understanding of intertribal relations was equally vital. Thanks to his connections, the Pilgrims could trade with neighboring tribes, obtaining furs and food in exchange for European tools. He even accompanied them on exploratory journeys, warning them of conflict zones and preventing disastrous clashes. However, Squanto's relationship with the Pilgrims was not without tension. Some Wampanoag leaders distrusted his loyalties, accusing him of exploiting his position for personal gain. At one point, he attempted to flee when accused of treachery but later returned to continue his mediation. Despite this, his role in those early years remained indispensable. He was a bridge between two cultures and a teacher to those who did not know how to survive in this new land. When Squanto died suddenly of fever in 1622, the Pilgrims lost more than just an interpreter, they lost the man who had made their survival possible. After his passing, relations with local tribes gradually deteriorated, a sign that his role had been far greater than history often recorded. In the end, he was the man whose knowledge and adaptability gave Plymouth Colony a chance to endure in a world that could have easily destroyed it.